Today, we dive into two epic tales of power, destruction, and divine wrath. A warrior god faces the forces of chaos. A once mighty empire crumbles under a divine curse. These stories, the Lugal-e and the Curse of Agade, reveal how Mesopotamians understood fate, kingship, and the gods' unpredictable justice. Stay tuned as we quantumly transcend time to uncover the mysteries of these ancient myths. Welcome to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, comparative mythology enthusiasts, and last, but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias, welcome to the show. Whether your interest is Atlantis, Zeus, or anything in between, we tackle it all with logic and reason from our quantumly entangled castle tucked away in the ancient flood-battered Central Pangaean mountain range. We are the one-stop shop for myth, history, and mystery, decoding it all through the lens that the spiritual is the geometric fourth dimension. There will be some additional trigger warnings for this episode. We are going to mention some reproductive comments very briefly, so I'd say if you have a preteen listening, this probably won't be the best episode for them. But aside from that, listener discretion, is advised for that. Only other trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation. So if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, you'll want to turn off the podcast now. Be sure to also subscribe for more if you're listening on YouTube. If you're loving myth retellings and deep dive breakdowns, be sure to like as well. And if you're listening on other podcasting platforms, please just take a minute to give us a good rating on there. Helps us get some traction and get the podcast out to other excited listeners like yourself. I'm going to kick it over to our resident psychologist, Madison, to give us a Psych Fact.
Don't call me a psychologist yet. I'm not yet.
All right, you're a psychologist Padawan. How about that?
Sure. I'll take it. Alzheimer's.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So it's a neurodegenerative disorder. Yeah. So there's a lot that can cause it. I can't talk today.
That's happened to me so many episodes, and I've had to lead them. So
yeah,
you'll do fine. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. So Alzheimer's.
Just say Alzheimer's 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row.
Alzheimer's is the thing. A lot can cause it from environment, genetics, age, that sort of thing. But one specific cause could be lack of sleep. So when you sleep, I believe it's beta amyloids. But when you sleep, those beta amyloids, it's a type of protein, and it gets flushed out of your brain. Your brain kind of goes through a cleaning phase when you sleep. So if you have a lack of sleep, your brain does not clean properly, and then you get a buildup of those beta amyloids, and then that buildup can contribute to Alzheimer's. So make sure to get some sleep.
So what I'm hearing is the master's program keeping you up is contributing to you potentially having Alzheimer's in the future.
Yeah, watch them make me have Alzheimer's. The other night I only slept 2 hours.
Yeah, not healthy. Don't do that.
No, don't. I am not recommending it.
Definitely not a good. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was my fact.
All right, sweet. Well, thank you much. Make sure you get your sleep out there so that you can retain your memories, because memories are a core component of who you are. And if you lose your memories, you kind of almost lose who you are in an aspect of I don't know. I'm having trouble talking apparently too. But you kind of like,
I get what you're trying to say.
yeah, like memories are like a defining factor of you, and you're kind of like the collection of your experiences. And so it's not lost entirely, but if you lose your memories, you kind of lose like a part of yourself almost.
Well, and that's why they have reminiscence therapy for older adults dealing with that, because then they can.
Sounds familiar. I vaguely remember what it's about, but I can't put my finger on it.
It's when you try to invoke remembering certain memories.
I was going for a joke there. I don't think you got it.
I didn't even realize. I'm sorry.
It's that 2 hours of sleep talking.
Oh.
All right. Anywho, unless you have anything else you want to add, I guess we'll shift gears here so that our user 123 doesn't get too mad. We're going on a psychology tangent.
Let's do it.
So we are going to go into episode overview here. So first things first, what we're going to cover today, we're going to go over some stuff from last episode actually first because it kind of flows sequentially. I'm going to hit on some more things I uncovered in the Gilgamesh and Lilith connections. And then we're going to jump into the Lugal-e retelling and then comparative mythology, and then the Curse of Agade retelling and comparative mythology. Then we're going to do a recap, and we're going to hit the conclusion from there. So be a pretty systematic flow. For those of you that are just joining us for the first time, I'd recommend starting with the Anzu episode, 2 episodes back, and then catch up on the Lilith episode, because what we're about to jump into here is going to rely some on that. And if you don't have that background, you might be a little bit lost. I'll try to fill in the gaps some, but... So, I mean, proceed at your own discretion. If you think you can figure it out on the fly, then by all means. But yes, so I was digging in a little bit more to just the idea of Lilith and Gilgamesh and some of the connections there. I don't even remember what got me started on that, but I was just kind of like vaguely curious about some stuff. And I did some digging, and apparently from the Sumerian king list, we talked about this, I think it was episode 39, with Gilgamesh's dad. It referenced him as being like an invisible being, or like we kind of speculated maybe that means he just wasn't present or something like that. But apparently the actual word that's used here is Lilu, which is the male counterpart to the Lilith spirit. So that kind of blew my mind there. And again, this emphasizes the problems in translation, is because they'll say like invisible being, or like, some kind of priest or something like that in the translation, but that doesn't really encapsulate these connections that exist when you actually start digging deeper into these mythology accounts. And so it's like, if this is just like, one small thing I was able to find that people have already connected, how many more connections exist that you just can't figure out unless you can literally read cuneiform and like understand the text itself.
Well, and I don't know if we already mentioned this, but when you're translating from one language to another, like some languages do not have words for certain things like another language does. I know I don't have a specific example off the top of my head, but I know it is.
I've mentioned it before, maybe not on episodes you've been on, but yeah, like a great example of this is the Greek words for love versus our one word for love. Just a couple off the top of my head is like agape, I think, is kind of like a sacrificial love. And then you have philos, which is a brotherly love, like a camaraderie love. You have erotikos or erotos, which is more of like a sexual romantic type of love. And then I think there's a couple more as well that I'm forgetting. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of words they use to describe love, and we only have love. And so it's like, you could say, I love you, babe, and I love you, man, and it's the same word, but the context and the implication is subjective and has a lot of meanings. And so that's where ancient languages do tend to shine, because sometimes they can actually give us more insights into what something means than what our English version is. So yes, no, you definitely have hit the nail on the head here. And we're going to do a whole episode. I'm going to run through a whole bunch of different things like this I've come across with the Bible and with Mesopotamian mythology and stuff that we've talked about a little bit, and just consolidate it into one episode to be like, hey, here's a whole list of things just so you as the listener can have an example set of problems that exist in translations. So you can be aware of these things and critically think about them as you do your own studies, if that's where you're so inclined to go, so that you're equipped to be like, hey, I'm looking at this thing. It's translated as Thunderbird, actually was one, which turns out that Anzu was I think comparable to that. But it's like, hey, they specifically chose Thunderbird here. Why did they choose that? And then, asking those deeper questions. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, so, I mean, this really adds into the Gilgamesh's 2/3 god, 1/3 man aspect, where his father is supposed to be like a literal demon. So it connects all the dots. Mind blown. Nailed it that time. Figured out the sound pad.
Figured it out.
Yes. Yes. It took a lot of digging to find that, I must say, because I saw there were 6 to 7 wiki articles or random websites that were saying Lilu, and I'm like, no, I refuse to use wiki as a source. I need to find an actual academic source. So I dug up a bunch. There's one. I'll have sources in the show notes for this research that I did here, kind of connecting all of this. So if you're interested to kind of dig into some of those academic resources, those are available in the show notes.
Anywho.
But a little bit about Lilu real quick before we shift into the Lugal-e. The Lilu and Lilith seem like they're supposed to be more like storm or wind demons, which I think was an interesting note to hit on as we're about to transition into what we're going to be talking about with one of Ninurta's feats. That's the Lugal-e that we're referencing. And specifically the Lilu, I'm not going to get into details here, but it's supposed to affect male sexuality in certain aspects. So there's some interesting connotations there. Yeah, I'm not going to explain further. If you're interested, there's articles below in the show notes that you can dive into that. But it's like a male sexual demon, and then the Lilith is supposed to be the female sexual demon.
Like a succubus or
yeah,
something?
stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all I'm gonna say then.
Yeah. So I'll let the listeners kind of have their own discretion on that. Yeah. So I mean, that took a little longer than I was kind of expecting. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just do a short break here and then come back strong with telling the tale of the Lugal-e. I hope you are prepared, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, because we are about to transcend time and listen to the story of Ninurta on another one of his feats, but this time he's not up against Anzu, the supposed Satan of mythology. He is up against Asag, who is a monstrous demon-like creature that comes up from the earth. So I don't know if we ever really fully talked about Ninurta himself, so I'll kind of get a little bit of more information about him here. He's a deity of war and agriculture, and he has a number of feats that he's done previously that are actually listed in this mythology account. And in this one, he goes up and he does battle against Asag, who is a monstrous demon. We see kind of see some themes of divine kingship, of war, of order versus chaos playing into this. It's one of the older hero versus monster myths that exists out there. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of the name of it.
Like Beowulf?
Maybe. I'm not too familiar with Beowulf. There's one other one I'm trying to think of. It's like a medieval one. St. George and the Dragon. I mean, this isn't exactly it, but the similar vague motif might exist of a divine or royal knight creature, knight hero coming along and slaying some monstrous creature or evil entity. So I mean, and then we do kind of see the theme and motif of Marduk versus Tiamat in the Enuma Elish continue along later in other myth, in that other myth. So the actual myth itself of the feat of Ninurta here, the demon Asag rises from the underworld and he leads a horde of stone warriors. He has like there's a bunch of warriors and each is correlated to like a specific stone. So it doesn't really specify like if these are like well, what exactly these are.
You know what that immediately made me think of?
What?
Terracotta warriors.
I mean, yeah, that's one way to look at it, but each one is like made of a different stone.
Yeah, no, it just made me think of that.
Yeah, no,
That was cool.
But no, that is an interesting comparison to make, is to kind of think of like terracotta warriors, but each made of like a different type of stone, like, you know, like flint and granite and things like that. So Asag comes up and starts terrorizing the people of Earth, and the world is thrown into chaos. Cities are pillaged and everything. Rivers are drying up. There's gashes put into the mountainsides. So the gods, the pantheon of Mesopotamians, calls upon Ninurta. He's the divine warrior of Enlil, and he arms himself. He charges out into battle, and he has a lion-headed weapon that levels mountains. It's understood to be like a mace that has this lion's head that actually talks to him, and it's like it respects him and like reveres Ninurta. It's like giving him advice throughout the battle almost, which is kind of interesting.
That's original.
It is original.
Sounds pretty cool, actually.
So it kind of goes ahead of Ninurta, and Ninurta's looking at it, in pride as the mace is leveling mountains before him. And then the mace sees Asag lying in wait, waiting to ambush Ninurta, and it comes back and it reports to its master and lets him know of what lays in wait. Advises him to not even attack him, but Ninurta decides to anyway. The battle's brutal. Asag's forces attack Ninurta and nearly overwhelm him, ripping into the earth. The sky's red, rivers are drying up, and then Ninurta unleashes his weapon and he emerges victorious. He slays Asag, and order is restored. And so Ninurta reorganizes the land and brings order to everything once again. So we kind of see that similar motif to the Enuma Elish. And it's kind of like a reinforcement of the god's authority, basically, because all of the Mesopotamian pantheon was basically cowering in fear over Asag's mighty power when he came up from the earth. Yeah. Then the second half is really interesting, and this is where I'm frustrated I can't understand cuneiform, is because what's lost in translation is actually there's a series of puns that go into this, which I love my puns, but Ninurta actually, he goes through and finds each and every single stone, and he either curses it or blesses it according to whether it fought against him or if it recognized his authority and divine rule. So yeah, so if they resisted him, he curses it. If it kind of like obeyed his authority, embraced his authority, he said, you know what, I'm going to pronounce a good judgment for you. And then one of the other segues afterwards, it kind of talks about his return, and he has all of the slain beasts from his various feats are actually mounted on his chariot, and one of them is Anzu. So that's a good callback for our listeners to episode 43. Yeah, 43.
Somewhere in there. I don't know. Just watch all of them.
Yeah, there you go. That's the solution. Just memorize all of the MQuad episodes, come in and correct us. But yeah, so it's a very interesting story. It's a very long one and kind of repetitive. But that's really the flow of what happens when you boil down the core essence of it. So heading into our comparative mythology analysis, how does this compare to other myths? We see there's a chaos being that arises, and then a hero is called upon by the gods, and the gods are terrified of this entity. The gods are terrified of this entity, and they trust, they pick a warrior to specifically fight this chaos creature. And so we see that in the Enuma Elish. We see that in Anzu versus Ninurta. And then there's other exploits that Ninurta does where he fights like a 6-headed beast, the 7-headed serpent that we've talked about. He fights at least Jeremy Black's version says like a mermaid-like creature. He has all of these things that he's beaten, even like a copper beast or something akin to that. Again, this is where translation comes in, and I'd like to see more of this and be like, okay, what is it defining as copper here? How does that fit? What is it really saying if we look at the linguistics? But yeah, I mean, this kind of feeds into that the divine right to rule aspect a little bit, where there's a divine appointment. You know, someone that goes out and achieves great feats is kind of given divine blessing for their rule and their kingship and the order that they bring to the world. Let's see here. I mean, I still speculate this is Michael the Archangel we're talking about, you know, and that these two may be the same entity, because we see this myth builds off of the other Anzu myth, you know, where there are these feats of Ninurta that are documented. Another thing I thought is interesting too, as I was looking at all of this, is Ninurta is talked about as going out with winds. That he has 8 different winds that he rides out to battle. And I was kind of thinking about this, and I'm like, you know, there's a lot of connections in motifs here from other things that we've seen. First off, there's the demonic spirits we've just talked about, Lilith, Lilu, and others that are demons of like wind and storm. And supposedly, I want to dig into this more. I haven't actually done too much research, but supposedly King Solomon from the Bible, in a more esoteric understanding, had supposedly subjugated certain demons to use them for his purposes and his accomplishments and achievements. So you do have to wonder if this is a similar motif that the Mesopotamians are trying to communicate here. If like Ninurta has maybe even subjugated demons, or if this is literal wind. Another thing that this brought to mind was with Adapa as well, because it emphasizes that, you know, Adapa breaks the wing of, I believe it's the south wind that knocked him off of his boat. Adapa was like the similar one to Adam that we did with Inanna's descent in Etana. And so you've got to wonder too, like, looking at that in relation to like how Lilith is translated in Isaiah from the last episode when we looked at that, how there's like an understanding that like night creature or flying night creature, there's kind of an implication there's a wing present there, and how she sometimes gets translated as like an owl or a night bird. So you've got to wonder like how much of this is just metaphorical to communicate flying when they say wings in older accounts like these, and how much of them is actual literal, like they literally had wings, like, you know, in a spiritual physical sense, like their actual spiritual bodies have wings to them. So these are some good questions to ask. I don't have the answers to them, but I just wanted to kind of throw out some speculations out there. Asag is kind of addressed as a chaos monster. You know, maybe he's a representation of natural disasters. You've also got to wonder, you know, maybe he's a high-ranking angel that we'll maybe find some parallels to in like the Book of Enoch or something like that. That he kind of descends and falls and then rises up against the divine order after he sees the fall of Anzu or Lucifer, you know, however you want to interpret that. There wasn't a great depiction of what exactly Asag is in the myth itself, but it referenced that Asag slides its head on the ground like a snake, which I thought was a good parallel to what we see in Genesis 3 with the curse that God brings in the beginning of Genesis 3:14, cursing the snake to, you know, not be able to use its legs and to eat the dust of the earth for all of its days. So you've got to wonder, you know, because if we're looking at this chronologically, Anzu is cast down probably before, if we're putting these on a chronological timescale, if we can even do that. And we're looking at it from like that biblical Meso perspective kind of merged together. Ninurta, maybe Michael the Archangel here, fights and defeats Anzu very early on in creation, probably before Genesis 3 kicks off. And then we've got this other entity rising up that's a serpent-like creature that Ninurta is then coming in and slaying. Maybe this is post-Genesis 3, you know, as like the serpent's judgment. And maybe this is kind of like a symbology of the chaos it's bringing into the world. And then, you know, another way to look at it too is this thought got brought to me recently by someone I was talking with. They had mentioned that maybe Anzu having the Tablet of Destinies from our previous one was like kind of a representation of being able to alter the destiny of man, almost, in a sense, by tempting them in the garden. So you can kind of see that these don't exactly maybe fit together perfectly, and that's where I think that the mythology bleeds into it. But I think there is a way to pick out the threads of this mythical matrix of the myth that we're constantly in pursuit of, and to try to connect all of these dots where it is a loose connection, but I do think it's there to draw some parallels. But yeah, what do you think? So I've been going on for a while. Any insights, or are you just too tired running on 2 hours?
I really don't have that much insight. But I keep going back to the wind and like symbology. And I don't know, maybe I'm too jaded, but I don't think that much of this is literal. I think the vast majority of any of these stories is more metaphorical.
I think there is metaphor in here.
Yeah.
And so I would agree that we do have to keep in mind that I think there is some metaphor present, but I do think there is also some literal aspect too.
Yeah, like there could be some literal, but I think I just lean more towards metaphorical.
That's fair.
I mean, historically, they really valued their metaphors in poetry, speaking in a poetic way. So
right, and yes, I mean there is certainly mythology accounts and tales that are told more in kind of like a poetic way. So there is certainly some credence to that. But then there's also, you've got to think about it too, that a lot of things in ancient times were put into like song form, and so therefore they were translated into poetic form, but it was still a true story, just kind of certain things were exaggerated, where it's like that fish story aspect. Every single time you tell someone, what you caught and how big it was, it gets bigger each and every single time that you retell it. Oh yeah, I caught a 2-foot fish. It was a 4-foot fish, 20-foot fish.
Ends up being like a 150-foot fish.
You end up being that guy or gal on social media that puts a G.I. Joe action figure holding your fish and taking a picture with it to make it look bigger. Anyway, so no, I think that there is probably some metaphor in here with like with the rock monsters, because like what's up with all of that?
Yeah.
I think that there's probably some metaphor present here, but I do wonder, since we're looking at like a snake-like entity like Asag crawling around, and he's equated to having traits like these, how much of that is just like equating things like the Genesis 3 curse versus more literal aspect to his depiction and what he is. So I think there's a balance, and you have to think about it from both angles. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that approach. But I do like to take that literal approach, because I think a lot of people just breeze over it all and it's like, oh, it's all metaphor, so we don't need to look at this literally.
Yeah, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I think that there's that literal aspect we have to pursue and hunt down and think about. But we do have to balance that as well with being like, hey, this is speculative. And especially when we're going off on something more like this, I think it's more speculative than something like Anzu, where it was very clear, cut and dry. We could draw like parallels to 4 different books of the Bible from literally Genesis to Revelation and be like, hey, there are all these connections. This seems like the same literal story, just encoded in that maybe slightly metaphorical motif. So, thoughts?
I agree.
Sweet. Makes my job easy. If you disagree, email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com so that we can spur on some of the Socratic method here and pursue knowledge together. Yeah, so I mean, my confusion here is like, what's up with the rock monsters? Is it kind of I wonder, I have a couple speculations on this. Maybe it's a metaphor for like taming the elements somehow, because supposedly when the angels come down in Enoch, which we are going to do Enoch in the not too distant future and break that down, they teach mankind all this technology and forbidden knowledge basically in some aspect or another. And we see this mirrored as well in, I want to say Genesis 5 maybe, where mankind is developing technology very rapidly within the first couple of generations. So,
do you mean the DNA stuff.
Not DNA necessarily, just technology.
Okay.
Like the Book of Enoch talks about like them bringing like I think like how to forge swords and all these other things. But it's been a while since I've dove into Enoch. That's one of the next myths we're going to do after we kind of get through most of Mesopotamian. Is Enoch will be tied back in.
All right.
So I think it has set some good groundwork.
But anyways, the rock monsters.
Yeah, and another thing that stood out to me when we were talking about these rock monsters here is like in the Gospels, Jesus talks about the that if the people don't praise his return coming into Jerusalem, and that if he tells them to be silent, that the rocks are going to cry out, which I think is interesting. I'm not saying there's a parallel here, but it's just an interesting thought that we see a reference to this idea of the rocks having a voice and a maybe almost a personality to a degree, being vaguely communicated in scripture. And then we have this idea here of like actual like rock monsters where it seems like Ninurta is going through and more cursing the stone type itself or blessing the stone type itself rather than the specific entity. So it's speculative. I'm not saying this is absolute. I just want to make these connections for the listeners, and maybe you as the listener will have something to chime in and correct us on, or to adjust our direction on. So definitely email into the show if you have some thoughts. Big shout out goes out to Cordell though, because I mean, he asked that whole Lilith question and that's turned into an episode and a half's worth of content. So, I mean, if you are thinking about emailing in and asking something and you think, oh, we're not going to listen, we're not going to care. We
definitely care.
Very clearly we care, because it's, that's actually where a lot of my episode ideas have come from. It's just communications and like seeing where people's thoughts are online, being like, okay, where can I address this stuff? So
thank you, Cordell.
Yes, thank you. Last connection I wanted to make is that we see this kind of taught in like the, well, not taught, but like illustrated in the Chronicles of Narnia, where C.S. Lewis kind of had gone into the occult for a while. And he takes this idea from the occult of like tree spirits and dryads and water spirits and all of that. All of these different things of nature having spirits associated to them. And I kind of wonder if this is where, this idea comes from, or maybe this is a different representation of that idea of like these different types of stones had different spirits that were supposedly connected to them in the occult. So that's another connection, because it does seem like Mesopotamians might have leaned a little bit more in that direction aside from their polytheistic worldview, with all of the beliefs around spirits and everything as well that we see with Lilith and Lilu. Yeah, last thing that I wanted to make an interesting note on, referencing C.S. Lewis, I'll also reference his good buddy J.R.R. Tolkien, that many are probably familiar with Asag, the Defiler character from the Hobbit movie, who is not in the Hobbit book, but I think he's mentioned in the Lord of the Rings book, and that's where they got the idea from. But that is, just the name sounded really familiar to Asag, Azog. And so I kind of, wonder there, because I know Lewis studied ancient mythology a good bit. So I wonder if Tolkien also kind of had studied mythology, or if he talked to Lewis about that, because they were, for those listeners that don't know out there, they were actually good friends, and they bounced ideas off of each other pretty regularly. So that kind of concludes the initial thoughts here on the Lugal-e with Ninurta. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we transition?
No, I did not.
All right, well, stay tuned, and we are going to talk about the cursed city of Agade and its fall, and then do some comparative analysis on that. And then we're going to recap everything and close out the show. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Why did the gods curse the city of Agade? what did Naram Sin do so wrong? Was it the god's fickleness, or was it something that he did that displeased him, or was it something beyond our understanding that this myth doesn't even encapsulate? We're asking the hard questions here on myth and mystery, on musings on mysteries and the mythical matrix. It's our job. So thank you for sticking with us here. We are back to talk about the Curse of Agade, where gods abandon an empire. So what exactly is the Curse of Agade? It's like a lamentation poem or writing describing the fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BC. The Akkadian Empire actually didn't have a very long life. They collapsed about 200 years after their founding, give or take. But the language stuck around for a very long time. So the Curse of Agade specifically focuses on the king Naram Sin, who angers the gods, and it leads to the downfall of Agade, can also be equated to Akkad, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's also another good example of using mythology to explain historical events, and so you do have to wonder how much of this is, again, metaphorical with the deities and what they're doing versus literal. Are the deities just a way to explain the natural phenomenon of the world, or is there an essence of truth to these deities existing, in our far distant past? And so these are important questions to keep in mind. One other thing I'll hit on is it seems from my research that we haven't even found Agade. Its collapse was that harsh, brutal, and it's just lost to history. And so this is kind of like the Mesopotamian version of Atlantis, if you will, in a sense. They're not as dramatic and as exciting, but it is still worth mentioning. I'm not going to have a lot of different comparative analysis to add to this one, I think, but this is going to be a good foundation, I think, to study Atlantis and other missing civilizations, and to analyze them, to shed light onto them, to maybe get in the minds of the ancients a little bit more and to see how they're writing about these tales. But yeah, no, it helps show how they interpret empire collapses, and I think it's important to cover from that aspect. So we can definitely parallel this to Atlantis in at least that sense. I certainly don't think they're the same city, of course, but so Agade is ruled by Naram Sin. It's a mighty empire in its time. The gods just kind of get frustrated with it, though, for some reason. And it's not really said in the text, so we have to ask why. Is it the pride of the people, hubris, some kind of sacrilege that they do? Is it the fickleness of the gods, or is it maybe even the same reason that Urim or Ur collapsed, where it's the shifting of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that just leads to the natural collapsing of cities because there's no longer a means of transport to it? And I do think there's some credence to this idea, because in the beginning of this, we see that everything's going well. And the phrase is even used that Inanna opens the portals of the rivers, basically, and so that they're able to use it to kind of, my implication of it is they're kind of using it to transport goods. And so the inference there is that, initially things are well in terms of trade and all of that, and that at some point, all the gods just kind of withdraw their favor from it. So did you have anything you were wanting to add? So I said you had a smirk.
I think it's interesting that the last part of the, ruler's name was Sin.
Yeah, I wonder, I don't think there's too much to that in terms of...
Probably not, but I thought it was interesting.
It is ironic, yes. I don't think Sin meant the same thing to the Mesopotamians. I think, there's different
Probably
connections
not.
there. But yes, no, that's definitely an interesting note to observe. So we see the gods withdrawing their favor one by one, where initially Inanna, Ishtar, kind of has some favor for the city, and she blesses it and shows it these gifts and everything, and resides there for a little bit. And then the other gods aren't really giving it favor, so she kind of like takes her stuff and goes. And then one by one, like Ninurta, Enlil, Enki all start withdrawing their favor and their belongings from the city. And it's kind of a sad downfall because Naram Sin seeks the guidance from the gods, but he only receives silence in response. And eventually he's like depressed for 7 years, and he sees in a dream that Agade doesn't have a place in the future of the world, that Agade is destined to be forgotten. And he's very sorrowful over this. So eventually it gets to the point where he's just angry and he lashes out, and he actually goes to the temple of Enlil and attacks it and desecrates it, which Enlil is the chief deity. So, I mean, if your city's destined for destruction, going and destroying the chief deity's temple is probably not the best way to go. But
I mean,
I do think this is interesting, though, because we even see this kind of idea today with like, people rejecting Christianity and turning to like atheism. Sometimes this is not everybody, but there are some people out there that just get angry with God because they feel like God should do X, Y, or Z, and that he doesn't, and that they just like walk away from their faith. And this is kind of almost like, this is an interesting parallel to show that, yes, even the ancients are human. And even in these tales where they're written drastically different, we still see these human elements where Naram Sin has a human reaction where after 7 years of not receiving the god's favor, he's like, you know what? I'm going to attack the gods because I'm going to lash out. It's the only form of control I have left. So it's kind of cool from a psychological perspective to see that depression kind of shift to anger, and to, him attacking and trying to defy the gods in whatever way that he could, that he had left. So I think it's cool in that aspect to kind of see that. So, but yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, from the Mesopotamian perspective, of course, this seals his fate and the destiny of his city. And so they completely abandon Agade, and the empire collapses. This spurs on the invasion of the Gutians. It's another people group. They're referred to as having dog-like instincts and appearing like monkeys. So I think this is kind of a way to insult the Gutians and to speak to their primitive nature, that they're really like animalistic, basically. There's no humanity to them. Which, I mean, again, you kind of have to ask, is that just them interpreting it that way because they're not our people, or is it that they were literally just that brutal? Because you do see precedent in like various cultures where they'll like brand the bad guys cannibals and this and that and the other thing so that they kind of have more of a just cause, and oftentimes that's not the case. So it's like the saying that...
should we have given a trigger warning for cannibalism?
I'm just mentioning it in passing. People will be fine. I'm not going into detail. But no, I think that, that derailed me.
Sorry. You said reminds you of a quote.
Yeah, the history is written by the victors. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminds me too of Hannibal, who was from the Carthaginian Empire, who faced the Romans in the BC era, and how his whole story was wiped away by the Romans, and they were the ones that chose to tell his story. I'm sad. I would have loved to have read Hannibal's memoirs. That is a heartbreaking thing to me. What's up? You just had a light bulb moment. Share with the listeners.
Hannibal, like he was branded a cannibal?
No.
Okay, never mind then.
No.
I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
No, he wasn't branded a cannibal. Not by the Romans, no.
I was going to make a connection to the movie, and I was like, nah.
Okay.
That doesn't, no. It's okay.
All right. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, Agade is destroyed. The water sources dry up, and no one... Kind of how it ends is that anyone that decides to stay at Agade, no one is going to rest comfortably there. And that's kind of the conclusion to it. So it kind of, I think, served as a good divine warning to people to respect the gods, because if you didn't respect the gods, then your kingdom that you had established and worked so hard for was going to fail no matter how hard you tried or lashed out against the gods, because you wouldn't be able to usurp the gods' power. And I think an interesting biblical parallel to bring to this is Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. And this is an interesting idea here, where we see it's taught in the Bible that there are certain angels, because I think that's what's being referred to here with sons of God, using that Genesis 6 interpretation. I don't think I need to really defend that too much for our avid listeners of the show, where God is appointing these angels to rule over different aspects, or not different aspects, excuse me, different nations. And that then if the people of the nation, for whatever reason, displease these angels, that the angels could abandon this one nation and go and seek out another nation. And maybe even that's what happened to Agade. It wasn't so much Agade did anything wrong, but that the divine angel appointed over Agade decided to pull back its favor rather than it being the Mesopotamian pantheon. It was just the singular angel that withdrew its favor and said, you know what, I'm going to give my favor to this other nation instead because they have more potential or their rules more aligned with biblical principles or whatever reason you want to spin on it. So it's just another interesting way to kind of think about it. But yeah, you do see this idea of God appointing divine beings over nations, which are often associated with city-states. And that concept is mirrored in both Mesopotamian, Greek, and Egyptian culture. And I'm sure many other cultures we could also compare to. But yeah, I mean, it does kind of align a little bit with the Genesis 11 principle where, God is dispersing the nations and assigning, various rulers to the different nations as well. So... And then for more like historical, political implications, we kind of already hit on this. It was kind of a warning. And for those that received the god's favor, I think it was that the Curse of Agade was kind of used as a lesson that if you received the favor of the gods, it legitimized your rule. And we see this theme echoed even in Atana, which was a precursor to this, where Atana is seeking divine favor not only for him, but for an heir, or maybe even divine favor for his heir, if you go back and listen to our episode on that. So any other final thoughts that you want to add in here?
So I just looked it up, and it was a little bit about like internal problems of the empire. So they had rebellions and conflict. There were external threats, like you mentioned, the Gudians,
Mm-hmm.
and then environmental. So you mentioned the rivers.
Yeah,
like
the potential rivers shifting.
yeah, but there's also droughts, crop failures. So they were getting hit on multiple fronts.
Yeah, and at a certain point, you just can't withstand, yourself as a nation when you don't have food and the enemy is closing in on all corners. And,
Yeah.
it's their way to try to explain things that may have just been natural processes as the kingdom fails. So, I mean, we do have to question how much this ties into a Mesopotamian pantheon versus a divine angel appointed to supervise the nation versus just natural failures over time and the collapse of an empire. But stay tuned. We're going to hit a recap here in just a moment and do a conclusion. And this is the last episode of Season 2 of Musings and Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. And we'll talk about the kind of new direction and shifting gears that we're going to do in Season 3 of how it's some new and a repeat of some old as well. So we will return in just a moment. Summarizing everything for you here on Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, giving you a recap of everything that we've discovered, everything we've speculated on, so that you can help synergize those connections and unravel the Mythical Matrix for yourself in your own mind. So I mean, to kind of recap everything that we've explored here as a whole, we started with that Gilgamesh and Lilu connection, and how Lilu, a Lilu demon, who is likely Gilgamesh's father, and that's what's communicated. Some of the implications of that, and expanding our understanding of the last two episodes with Anzu and with Lilith, and tying all of that in, and then flowing into more tales about Ninurta, connecting to the Anzu tale once again. Ninurta's feats of defeating Asag and some of the implications there, what that might mean, how that might connect to Genesis 3, how much of that is metaphorical versus more of a literal tale. And then from there, we flowed into the Curse of Agade, talking about what it actually represents about the fall of the Akkadian Empire, what the text says, why it happened, what we can speculate on based off of that, and just how you can fight a war on all fronts. And then, what does this mean? Is this just the ancients' ways to correlate natural forces, or is this a deeper question to something else going on that we might miss in our modern culture? So, I think that's a pretty good recap. Did I miss anything major that we hit on, so that we can be sure that we encapsulate it all for user 123?
I think we did.
All right, sweet.
If not, rewatch the episode.
Yeah, there you go. You could always re-listen if you're not satisfied with the summary. If there's like, man, there's one point that they really needed to recap for me, you can just go re-listen to that. It's okay. But yeah, so we'll roll into the general conclusion here, get some final thoughts out, and then do our closeouts from there. So, I mean, we see gods controlling the fate of kings and empires, and this is present more in the Curse of Agade, and then we see the gods stepping in as well to kind of save humanity from the more monstrous creatures, and that does seem to be their role. We see the Mesopotamian pantheon is used, I think, in a sense to explain natural disasters, invasions, historical change even, because we as humans just tend to always have that question in our minds of why is this happening. We even see this in the book of Job when Job starts suffering, where it's just a natural response to for any human. And it's you look at these myths, it's not a new question. We think it's a new question, but the question of suffering and why is an old question, as old as humanity itself, I'd argue, where people ask this and struggle to find answers. And I think some find answers that satisfy them and others don't. So it's a journey we all must take, and one that we can all relate to, whether we're in 3000 AD or 3000 BC. Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that these myths hold historical truths for you as the listener? We want to hear your thoughts. You can comment if you're on YouTube, or send us an email, m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You think it's a historical truth, pure propaganda, somewhat of a mix, somewhat metaphor? Where do you think everything falls? All right. So,
Down.
32 feet per second squared, 9.81 meters per second squared, till it reaches terminal velocity.
Okay.
Got to bring it all back to mathematics here. I'm using some mysteries in the mythical matrix. Anywho, all right. So season 3 direction. So we're going to kind of shift gears here a little bit. Let me pull up the tentative schedule of episodes that I have planned. We are going to circle a little bit back. We're going to get a little bit fringe. We're going to talk about aliens and alien abductions in the next episode with a guest. And then we are going to dig into a little bit of biblical stuff. There's an interesting question about genocide in the Bible that we've put out some video content on in short form, but I actually want to play with the idea itself on air, as I think it'd make a great episode. And I have another guest that's going to come on with us to kind of serve more of a co-host role with us, but talk about it a little bit. From there, we'll hit some more Mesopotamian mythology sprinkled throughout, some more. I still want to hit that myth plagiarism episode content that was from like 4 or 5 episodes ago that I was like, yeah, we'll get to this. And then all these other episodes with Lilith and Anzu hit. And it's just like, yeah, that it didn't end up happening.
Thanks, Cordell.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
Yeah. We're going to hit on some Mesopotamian philosophy down the road as well. There's some good stuff there. I actually have a trip planned in the near future as well that we're going to take and do a report on tentatively. Then we're going to go a little bit of the psychology direction with you for a little bit. You have some episodes for us there. So
Yeah.
do some problems of translation, maybe hit on a Mesopotamian law episode talking about like the Code of Ur-Nammu, Hammurabi, and others. Maybe a Shroud of Turin episode, the shroud that covered Jesus. I have a fantastic, I'm not going to say who it is, but I have a fantastic guest that's apparently done a ton of his own research into this topic that I'm trying to get on the show. So we'll see if we can twist his arm and get him on at some point. But we're gonna bounce around a little bit, so it's not gonna be just Mesopotamian mythology for the next bit. It's gonna be some biblical, and then Enoch some, and then a whole bunch of other. We're going to be all over the place.
Yeah.
We've honed in on Mesopotamian mythology for the last, pretty consistently for the last 10 episodes or so, I think, or something thereabouts. But it's time to start shifting gears here a little bit and asking some more broader questions. But this is going to be a great framework, I think, with looking at biblical mythology and Mesopotamian mythology and looking at all of these and the groundwork we've built with looking at science and quantum physics and all of these questions of psychology, the spiritual fourth dimension, playing with these ideas. I think this is going to be a beautiful sounding board for our future eventual explorations into Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, South American mythology, Norse mythology, and more that we are planning to eventually do on the show as well. So it might not seem like every single episode has necessarily might fit with the interests of the listener, and that's okay. If you need to pick and choose what's interesting to you, then by all means. But the intent of this is to kind of have an ongoing quantum, mathematically consistent conversation that we can systematically build off of. So it might seem like we're bouncing around, and sometimes we do. Sometimes tangents are necessary in math. User 1, 2, 3. But there is also a method to my madness. At least I hope so. Otherwise, you might have to do some counseling on me or something. But that wouldn't be
Ethically, I could not.
Yes, have to get another counselor too.
Yes.
So, but yes, we will still hit a couple more Mesopotamian mythology points in the near future. Lugal-e and the Anzu bird is going to be one that I have coming up. Another Anzu connection. That'll probably be a shorter episode. So definitely want to stay tuned. If you enjoyed this episode and you've enjoyed our other episodes, we're going to keep going in this direction, and we're going to keep digging into these myths and picking out the mythical matrix. And the more myths that we can build off of, the more we can kind of snowball and get that cumulative effect as we dive into later myths. So that being said, share the podcast with someone. If you're listening and you like the show, please let someone know that that we exist and that it might be a good fit. Help get us another fan or two. If you're interested in the supporting the show, helping keep the lights on, helping fund the research a little bit and all the expenses that go into producing, the Buy Me a Cup of Coffee link is in the show notes. It's m.quad.musings. As always, if you do a donation of $25 or more, you'll get mentioned as a producer on the subsequent show, or as soon as I see it, if I miss it. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, m.quad.musings. Be sure to give us a like, follow, subscribe. Facebook is Musings on Mysteries and Mythical Matrix. As always, email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com with your confessions, concessions, contentions, snide remarks, whatever you like about the show, whatever you don't like about the show. We want to hear from you. Just be warned. Don't send me your logical fallacies. It's not going to go well. We'll leave you anonymous, but you will likely get laughed at, potentially on the show. So, whether you've been listening on the earth with the mortals, in the stars of heaven with Enoch and the cherubim, or
down in Sheol,
we thank you from quantumly transcending time to join us for this epic mythology discovery, and hope you have a good rest of your night.
Bye.
Hula hoop tree.